The year is 1889. The Cascade Mountains are screaming. It is a deafening, terrifying sound that wealthy men, safe behind their mahogany desks and ledgers, believe they can silence with enough milled lumber and imported iron. But nature does not negotiate with ledgers, and the winter wind does not care how much money sits in your bank account. Outside, a cyclonic blizzard, a white leviathan born of a rare atmospheric pressure drop, is tearing the logging boomtown of Oakhaven apart. Milled pine walls, built with the arrogant certainty of modern industry, are buckling under the sheer aerodynamic pressure of the gale. The flat, rigid structures of the logging camp act like sails catching a hurricane. The iron stoves, the great pride and joy of the logging barons, sit dead and cold, their chimneys choked by an impenetrable, freezing wall of ice. Inside those expensive $450 cabins, the elite and the physically strong are shivering violently. Their breath crystallizes in the dark, their confidence reduced to primal, animal terror. They are freezing to death in monuments of their own arrogance. But less than half a mile away, deep within the dark, howling forest they so eagerly sought to clear-cut and destroy, there is silence. Complete, absolute, profound silence. A 16-year-old girl named Nora sits cross-legged on a soft, hand-woven bed of dry, fragrant pine needles. Next to her, her 5-year-old brother Leo is fast asleep. His small chest rises and falls in a steady, calm, unbroken rhythm. He does not cough. He does not shiver. The air around them is a stable, life-giving 68 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling faintly of clean wood smoke, roasted nuts, and ancient, rich earth. Nora is not in a mansion. She is not in a cabin built of expensive, geometrically perfect planks imported from the East. She is sitting inside the hollow, burned-out shell of a dead, giant sequoia tree. It is a colossal tomb of wood, struck by lightning centuries ago, left to rot by the logging company because it had no commercial value. They called it useless. They called her pathetic for crawling into it like a wild beast. Yet, as the cyclonic wind roars like a dying monster against the tree's exterior, the massive, cylindrical trunk simply parts the storm. It effortlessly redirects the kinetic force of the blizzard around its ancient curves, rendering the wind utterly powerless. Inside, the thermal mass of the earth and the supreme insulation of the dead, 2-foot-thick bark, hold the warmth of a handful of coals with the gentle, unyielding embrace of a mother. Nora rests her bare hand against the dark, charred interior wall of the tree. It is warm to the touch. The storm outside is a nightmare of jagged ice. The hollow tree is a sanctuary of life. The cost of her incredible survival? Exactly $0. The cost of the freezing town's imminent collapse? Everything they possessed. How does a cast-out, orphaned girl, armed with nothing but the clothes on her back and the fragile life of her little brother, engineer a thermal fortress that defies the wrath of a historic winter? How does ancient, forgotten wisdom triumph so absolutely over the arrogant, expensive technologies of the industrial elite? To understand the sublime justice of this frozen night, we must turn the clock back to the fading days of autumn, when the air was merely crisp, the leaves were turning to copper, and the cruelty of men was far colder than the approaching frost. It began when the machinery of greed took everything from Nora. Her father, a humble, hard-working timber faller, was crushed beneath a massive Douglas fir. He was a victim of the relentless, unsafe harvesting quotas demanded by the camp owner, Bartholomew Vance. Vance was a man who worshipped the god of profit above all else. To him, the ancient forest was merely a bank vault waiting to be violently emptied, and his workers were simply tools of flesh and bone, easily replaced when broken. When Nora's father died, there was no pension. There was no solemn moment of silence. There was only the cold, hard mathematics of the company ledger. Nora, at only 16 years of age, suddenly became the sole protector of little Leo, a child with lungs as fragile as spun glass, highly prone to severe bouts of winter pneumonia. Desperate, she approached Bartholomew Vance, standing in his opulent, violently overheated office, clutching her little brother's trembling hand. She asked for nothing more than to remain in their small, drafty workers' shack just through the winter months. She offered to cook, to mend thick wool clothes, to scrub the muddy floors of the men who had worked alongside her father. Bartholomew Vance looked at her from behind a heavy, imported mahogany desk, a thick cigar burning slowly between his plump fingers. He did not see a grieving daughter. He did not see a vulnerable child whose life hung in the balance. He saw an unauthorized occupant of company property. Foreman Griggs, a man whose soul had long been replaced by a cruel obedience to wealth and power, stood by the heavy oak door, chuckling softly at Nora's desperate, pleading eyes. "This camp is not an orphanage, girl," Vance declared, his voice smooth, calculated, and entirely devoid of human warmth. "Those cabins cost me $450 apiece to construct. They are for able-bodied men who produce timber. You produce nothing. You are a financial liability. By sunset, you will vacate the premises." Nora pleaded, her voice breaking, terrified not for her own life, but for the tiny, cold hand gripping hers. "Mr. Vance, please, the winter is coming. The old men say the snows will be deeper than ever. We have nowhere to go. My brother won't survive the freezing nights on the open road." Vance merely turned his leather chair toward the window, looking out at the endless, dark sea of ancient trees he fully intended to conquer and sell. "Then I suggest you ask the forest for a room. It seems to have plenty of vacancies out there in the dirt. Just make sure the spring thaw reveals your bones far from my property line. I won't have the smell of rot interrupting my spring harvest." Foreman Griggs laughed openly then, stepping forward and physically shoving Nora and Leo out into the biting, bitter November wind. They were exiled, cast out into the vast, unforgiving wilderness with $0, zero supplies, and the chilling promise of an incoming winter that would soon rewrite the history of the mountains. The wealthy men of Oakhaven retreated to their newly built, rigid-walled cabins, feeding expensive, imported coal into their cast-iron stoves, entirely confident that their money had bought them absolute immunity from the laws of nature. They looked upon the wilderness as a dumb, lifeless enemy to be dominated. Nora, however, looked upon the wilderness not as an enemy, but as a silent, ancient mentor. She did not have money. She did not have heavy iron or milled, perfect lumber, but she carried something infinitely more powerful in her mind, the deep, ancestral wisdom passed down by her grandmother, an understanding that the earth does not freeze those who know how to listen to its physical laws. We are about to witness exactly how the blinding arrogance of the wealthy became their icy tomb, and how a hollow, discarded dead tree became an impregnable fortress of thermodynamics and life. But before we journey deeper into the snowy, unforgiving depths of this ancient forest, I invite you to join our community. If you value the timeless wisdom of our ancestors, if you believe that true strength lies in humility and harmony with nature, rather than the blind worship of money, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a like to help this story reach others who need to hear it, and share it with those who appreciate the triumph of the resilient spirit over corporate greed. And tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you listening to this journey today? Your presence here keeps the legacy of the old ways alive. Now, let us return to the cold, unforgiving edge of the tree line, where a 16-year-old girl is about to prove to an entire town of men that the most advanced engineering on Earth does not come from a factory, but from the quiet, magnificent genius of the natural world. The heavy, wrought-iron gates of the Oak Haven logging camp slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed through the freezing valley like a judge's final gavel. The sound was a definitive, brutal severing of ties between the world of men, with its commerce, its artificial heat, and its arrogant certainty, and the raw, untamed expanse of the ancient woods. Nora stood on the outside of the perimeter fence, the frozen mud crunching beneath her thin leather boots. The temperature was already plummeting past 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun was bleeding a pale, sickly orange below the jagged horizon of the Cascade Mountains. A bitter, biting wind swept down from the high peaks, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of incoming snow. Beside her, little Leo shivered violently. His thin wool coat, a hand-me-down patched together with frayed thread, offered virtually zero thermal resistance against the plunging cold. A wet, rattling cough erupted from his small chest, a sound that drove a spike of pure, unadulterated terror directly into Nora's heart. She turned to look back at the camp. Through the gaps in the tall wooden palisade, she could see the glowing, amber windows of Bartholomew Vance's newly constructed worker cabins. They were rigid, rectangular boxes built from freshly milled, perfectly straight pine planks. To Vance and his men, these structures were the ultimate triumph of modern industry over the wild. They boasted loudly that each cabin had cost a staggering $450 to build and equip, a king's ransom in 1889. Black, oily smoke poured from their tin chimneys, the exhaust of expensive imported coal burning inside heavy cast-iron stoves that Vance had shipped all the way from Pennsylvania. The men inside were safe, or so they believed. They equated the expenditure of capital with the guarantee of survival. They believed that because they had purchased heavy iron and burned expensive fuel, the winter was a solved equation. It was the ultimate, blinding hubris of the wealthy, the assumption that nature is simply a commodity to be bought, sold, or ignored entirely if one has enough money in the bank. From the raised wooden walkway inside the gate, Foreman Griggs leaned over the railing, a steaming mug of black coffee in his thick, calloused hand. He looked down at the 16-year-old girl and her fragile brother with a mixture of amusement and profound contempt. To Griggs, poverty was not a misfortune. It was a moral failure, a weakness that deserved to be punished by the elements. "Enjoy the hospitality of the dirt, little girl." Griggs's voice boomed over the howling wind, carrying the harsh, abrasive tone of a man who drew pleasure from the suffering of those beneath him. "I give you until midnight, before that boy's blood turns to slush. You should have begged harder, maybe offered to work for free." A chorus of cruel laughter erupted from a group of loggers gathered near the gatehouse. They were men who had traded their empathy for the security of Vance's payroll. "Hey, Nora!" another logger shouted, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a kerosene lantern. "I hear the wolves are building a new hotel up by the ridge. Maybe they'll let you check in if you pay them with pine cones. Don't worry, we'll send a shovel out in April to scrape you off the rocks." They laughed because they felt invincible. They laughed because they possessed walls of milled wood and stoves of iron, and this child possessed nothing but the clothes on her back. They mocked the very idea that a human being could survive the crushing weight of a mountain winter without the financial infrastructure of their logging empire. They attacked the logic of her existence. How can you generate heat without buying coal? How can you find shelter without buying lumber? You are mathematically doomed. Nora did not answer them. She did not waste her precious, limited caloric energy on anger. Anger would not generate heat. It would only accelerate her heart rate and burn the finite fuel stored within her and her brother's shivering bodies. She possessed something that Griggs, Vance, and the mocking loggers completely lacked: the quiet, solemn wisdom of humility. She knelt down in the freezing mud, ignoring the stinging pain in her knees, and wrapped her arms around Leo. She pulled him close, unbuttoning her own modest coat to press his small, trembling body against her chest, utilizing the direct transfer of body heat, the most primal and efficient form of thermal sharing. "Listen to me, Leo," she whispered, her voice a steady, calm anchor in the rising storm. "Do not listen to those men. They are loud because they are afraid of the dark. But we are not afraid. The forest is not our enemy. It is our mother, and a mother does not let her children freeze if they know how to ask for her embrace." She stood up, lifting the 5-year-old boy into her arms. He was painfully light. With one last glance at the glowing, arrogant geometry of the Oakhaven camp, Nora turned her back on the industrial world and walked directly into the deep, suffocating darkness of the ancient timberland. The transition from the cleared logging perimeter into the virgin forest was immediate and shocking. The wind, which had been whipping across the stumps of the clear-cut land with ferocious, unimpeded velocity, suddenly broke against the massive trunks of the ancient trees. Here, beneath the canopy of giants that had stood for 1,000 years, the air was different. It was colder, yet the violent kinetic energy of the gale was severely dampened. Nora walked for an hour, her muscles burning, her breath pluming in the freezing air like steam from an engine. She was searching. She was not wandering aimlessly. She was scanning the topography, reading the landscape with the educated eyes of her ancestors. She knew she could not build a shelter from scratch. She had no tools, no axes, no saws. To expend energy trying to construct a lean-to out of frozen dead branches would be a fatal miscalculation of thermodynamics. She needed a structure that had already defeated the centuries. She needed mass. She needed natural engineering. And then, as the last dying light of the sun vanished, leaving the forest bathed in the ghostly silver luminescence of a rising winter moon, she saw it. Rising from the earth like a colossal, silent sentinel, its crown shattered by a lightning strike from a forgotten century, was a dead giant sequoia. It was a monstrous pillar of wood, at least 20 feet in diameter at its base. The logging company had left it standing because the lightning fire had burned through its core, hollowing it out from the roots to 20 feet up the trunk. To Bartholomew Vance, it was spoiled timber, entirely useless for milling, holding zero financial value. But to Nora, standing before its massive, charred opening, it was a masterpiece of thermal dynamics. It was a fortress. It was a home that cost exactly $0, yet possessed physical properties that the $450 cabins of Oakhaven could not even begin to rival. She stepped through the natural archway of the burned wood and entered the belly of the giant. The moment she crossed the threshold, the howling of the wind ceased. The absolute, deafening silence of the ancient wood swallowed them whole. The temperature inside the hollow was completely still. The elite had mocked her. They had guaranteed her death. But standing in the pitch-black silence of the massive tree, Nora ran her frozen fingers over the incredibly thick, fibrous interior bark, and a quiet, defiant smile touched her lips. She knew exactly what she had to do next. The real engineering was about to begin. Inside the hollow giant, absolute darkness wrapped around them like a heavy velvet cloak. The air was entirely still, severed completely from the violent, slashing kinetic energy of the blizzard beginning to rage outside. But stillness alone does not equal warmth. The ambient temperature was rapidly dropping toward 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and little Leo's shivering was a frantic, terrifying vibration against Nora's side. He needed heat, and he needed it immediately. Nora did not panic. Panic is a luxury of the unprepared, a waste of vital calories. She closed her eyes, breathing in the dry, ancient scent of the charred wood, and summoned the quiet, ancestral memory of her grandmother. Her grandmother had been a woman of the soil, a keeper of the old ways, who understood that the earth is not a dead, freezing rock, but a living, breathing battery of thermal energy. "The men of iron and money fight the winter," her grandmother used to say, her voice a soothing echo in Nora's mind. "They try to punch it, to block it with flat walls, but the winter is a river. You do not fight a river. You step out of its current, and you let the earth hold you." Nora laid Leo gently on a pile of dry, brown pine needles that had accumulated inside the hollow over decades. She removed her own coat and laid it over him. Now she had to work fast. The wealthy logging barons of Oakhaven believed that insulation required expensive, imported materials. They built their $450 cabins out of single-layer, milled pine, rigid, dense, and flat. It was an astonishingly poor architectural choice. Dense, solid wood is a terrible insulator. It acts as a thermal bridge, conducting the freezing exterior temperatures directly through the walls and into the room, while simultaneously leaking the precious heat of the coal stoves outward. Nora's shelter, which cost exactly $0, possessed a thermodynamic armor that industrial science would not fully replicate for another century. The dead giant sequoia was wrapped in bark nearly 2 feet thick. Sequoia bark is incredibly fibrous, packed with millions of microscopic air pockets and heavy tannins. In the realm of physics, dead trapped air is one of the universe's most supreme insulators. It severely interrupts conductive and convective heat transfer. It acts exactly like modern aerogel. The freezing cold of the winter wind simply could not penetrate the massive, spongy cellular structure of the giant tree. The hollow was a perfect, natural vacuum flask, but she still needed a heat source, and the ground beneath her feet was freezing, or, at least, the surface was freezing. Using a sturdy, broken branch of manzanita wood and a large, flat river stone she had carried in her pockets, Nora began to dig. She did not dig aimlessly. She was executing a precise application of passive geothermal engineering. While the surface dirt was frozen solid at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, physics dictates a beautiful, life-saving constant: the frost line. If you dig deep enough into the earth, below the reach of the surface weather, the ground maintains a constant ambient temperature of roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, year-round. For an hour, working in the pitch black, guided only by touch, she excavated a sunken bowl into the soft, centuries-old compost of the tree's deep root system. She lowered Leo into this earthen depression. Instantly, he was shielded from any residual drafts near the entrance, wrapped in the earth's massive thermal blanket. The soil itself became a radiant boundary, pulling the ambient temperature of his immediate surroundings up from freezing to a survivable 50 degrees. Next came the fire. This was the most dangerous equation. Inside the $450 cabins, the loggers burned expensive black coal in cast-iron stoves, but iron is volatile. It heats violently and cools rapidly when the fuel runs out. Furthermore, lighting a surface fire inside a hollow tree would fill the enclosed space with toxic wood smoke, suffocating Leo's fragile lungs within minutes. Nora required a zero-cost, high-efficiency, smokeless combustion engine. She built a Dakota fire hole. Working carefully at the edge of the sunken floor, she dug a small, deep hole about a foot straight down. Then, roughly a foot away, she dug a second, angled hole, tunneling beneath the dirt to connect the two pits in a U shape. This was not just a hole, it was a masterful exploitation of fluid dynamics and Bernoulli's principle. She gathered a handful of bone-dry twigs, crushed pine needles, and highly flammable pine resin from the interior walls of the tree. Using a single, precious friction match from her pocket, she sparked the tinder at the bottom of the main chamber. As the small fire caught, a magnificent physical reaction occurred. The rising heat from the flames created a rapid updraft, a localized low-pressure zone. This pressure differential violently sucked cold, fresh, oxygen-rich air down the second tunnel, feeding the base of the fire like a bellows. Because the fire was fed such a massive, concentrated amount of oxygen, the combustion was almost 100% complete. There was no unburned particulate matter. Therefore, there was absolutely zero smoke. The tiny hidden fire burned with the fierce, invisible intensity of a forge. It cost $0 to build, required only a handful of dead twigs to sustain, and produced more usable heat than the massive, gluttonous coal stoves of the wealthy elite. Nora carefully placed 6 dense, smooth river stones around the edge of the fire pit. This was the final piece of the ancestral puzzle: thermal mass. The stones absorbed the intense infrared radiation of the Dakota hole. Unlike iron, which cools quickly, dense stone possesses high thermal inertia. They act as thermal batteries. Once heated, they would radiate a steady, stable, luxurious warmth into the earthen bowl for 6 to 8 hours, long after the fire itself had burned down to ash. Within 90 minutes, the interior of the dead sequoia had completely transformed. The temperature inside the earthen bowl climbed to a stable, pristine 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was clean and breathable. Leo's shivering stopped entirely. His breathing deepened, his small face relaxing into a peaceful, warm slumber. Nora sat beside him, leaning her back against the thick, fibrous bark, the radiating heat of the stones soaking into her frozen bones. She had defeated the winter without spending a single penny. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, the pendulum of fate was swinging violently in the opposite direction. Inside cabin number 4, Foreman Griggs and a group of wealthy, elite timber investors who had come up for an inspection were gathered around a glowing, red-hot iron stove. The room smelled of expensive cigars, whiskey, and arrogant certainty. Outside, the atmospheric pressure was plummeting to historic, catastrophic lows. The wind had shifted from a howl to a demonic, high-pitched scream. "I wonder how the little rat is enjoying her dirt hotel," Griggs sneered, taking a long pull from a crystal glass of bourbon. A fat investor from San Francisco chuckled, warming his hands near the stove. "She's likely solid ice by now. It's a mathematical certainty, Griggs. You cannot generate thermal friction without heavy fuel, and you cannot block wind without milled timber and iron nails. That girl is trying to fight the modern age with twigs and mud. It's pathetic." "She dug a hole," another logger laughed, slapping his knee. "I saw her looking at the ground. She thinks the cold dirt is going to save her. These mountain people, they have no understanding of basic thermodynamics. You need iron. You need coal. Everything else is just a primitive delusion." They mocked her engineering. They openly ridiculed the very physics that were currently saving her life. To them, the idea of a Dakota firehole or passive geothermal mass was primitive, peasant nonsense. They put their complete, unwavering faith in the $450 price tag of their cabins, but they were fundamentally, fatally wrong. And the mountain was about to teach them a devastating lesson in structural physics. As they laughed, drinking their imported whiskey, none of them noticed the subtle, terrifying changes happening to their expensive fortress. The rigid, flat walls of the cabin were taking the full, broadside kinetic impact of the cyclonic wind. Because the cabin was a stiff, square box, it could not deflect the aerodynamic pressure like the cylindrical aerodynamic trunk of Nora's sequoia. The milled pine boards began to groan. Under the extreme, localized pressure of the gale, the wood began to warp and buckle. Microfissures, tiny gaps no wider than a blade of grass, began to violently rip open between the nailed planks. And then, the thermal theft began. The extreme velocity of the wind outside created a massive vacuum effect against the walls of the cabin. Like a phantom thief, the wind began to physically suck the expensive, coal-generated heat right out through the microfissures. The iron stove was glowing red, consuming dollars worth of coal by the hour, but the ambient temperature in the room suddenly began to drop. Fast. The wealthy men stopped laughing. The fat investor from San Francisco pulled his coat tighter, a look of sudden, profound confusion crossing his face as he realized his breath was beginning to crystallize in the air, right in front of a blazing iron stove. The elite had mocked the dirt. They had mocked the tree. But as the true fury of the cyclonic blizzard finally descended upon Oakhaven, ripping the roofs off the expensive cabins and turning their iron stoves into useless blocks of freezing metal, it was the arrogance of money that would face the ultimate, crushing test of nature. By midnight, the atmospheric pressure over the Cascade Mountains collapsed completely. What descended upon the Oakhaven logging camp was not merely a winter storm. It was a meteorological anomaly, a cyclonic blizzard born of a violent collision between Arctic air masses and Pacific moisture. The meteorologists of the modern era would call it a bomb cyclone. To the men of 1889, it was simply the end of the world. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. But the true killer was the wind. Roaring at an excess of 80 miles per hour, it created a wind chill factor that pushed the perceived temperature down to a catastrophic 50 below 0. At this extreme temperature, exposed human flesh begins to freeze solid in less than 5 minutes. The air itself transformed into a weapon, filled with microscopic shards of ice that sandblasted anything standing in their path. Inside the Oakhaven camp, the monumental hubris of Bartholomew Vance and his wealthy investors was meeting the absolute, unforgiving reality of physics. We must apply the pendulum of truth here, swinging between the arrogant chaos of the elite and the sublime, silent peace of the cast-out orphan. In the camp, the massive $450 cabins were undergoing a catastrophic structural failure. Milled lumber is rigid. It possesses zero flexibility. When a flat, perfectly vertical wall measuring 20 feet across is struck by an 80-mile-per-hour wind, it ceases to be a wall. It becomes a sail. The aerodynamic drag coefficient of a square box is incredibly poor. The kinetic energy of the cyclonic gale slammed into the broadside of the cabins, transferring thousands of pounds of sheer force directly into the joints and nails. Inside his opulent office, Bartholomew Vance was no longer smoking his cigar. He was standing in the center of the room, his face pale with a primal, animal terror, watching the walls of his empire literally bow inward. The expensive Pennsylvania coal stove, which had cost him over $300, was suddenly betraying him. The extreme velocity of the wind ripping across the flat tin roof of the cabin created a violent low-pressure vacuum, a massive Bernoulli effect. This vacuum began to overpower the natural updraft of the chimney. Instead of drawing smoke up and out, the intense negative pressure reversed the flow. Suddenly, the chimney became a pipe that sucked the freezing, sub-zero exterior air directly down into the combustion chamber of the stove. The red-hot iron hissed violently. In less than 20 minutes, the fire was physically choked to death by the descending column of freezing air. The $300 iron stove was instantly transformed from a heat source into a massive, freezing block of metal, radiating cold into the room. It became a fatal heat sink. Swing the pendulum. Less than a mile away, deep within the ancient howling forest, Nora sat in the pitch black, listening. She was not afraid. She was entirely at peace. The 80-mile-per-hour wind that was currently tearing the logging camp apart was also striking the dead giant sequoia, but the tree did not groan. It did not buckle. The physics of survival were on Nora's side. The massive, 20-foot-thick trunk was a perfect cylinder. When the cyclonic winds slammed into the ancient wood, there were no flat surfaces to catch the kinetic force. Instead, the air was forced to split, parting seamlessly around the curved aerodynamic contours of the giant. The tree simply deflected the hurricane. Inside the hollow chamber, the silence was absolute. The deafening roar of the storm outside sounded merely like a distant, rushing river. The temperature inside the earthen bowl remained locked at a pristine, life-saving 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. The Dakota fire hole had long since burned out, leaving only a small bed of white ash. It had consumed perhaps 3 handfuls of dead twigs, a cost of exactly $0. Yet, the 6 dense river stones Nora had placed around the pit were now performing a masterclass in thermal mass. Having absorbed the intense infrared radiation of the smokeless fire, the dense atomic structure of the stones was now slowly, steadily releasing that stored energy back into the enclosed space. The earth beneath them, acting as a massive thermal battery, trapped the heat, creating a warm, invisible cocoon. Little Leo, who Foreman Griggs had guaranteed would be frozen solid by midnight, shifted in his sleep. He pushed the heavy wool coat off his shoulders because he was actually sweating. His breathing was deep, clear, and completely unimpeded by the cold. Nora rested her hand against the thick, fibrous inner bark of the tree, feeling the gentle, radiating warmth of her zero-cost engineering. Swing the pendulum back to the camp. Total, unmitigated collapse. In cabin number 4, Foreman Griggs and the wealthy investors from San Francisco were experiencing the physiological terror of hypothermia. The microfissures between the milled pine boards had widened under the relentless wind pressure. The expensive cabin was now leaking heat faster than a sinking ship takes on water. The interior temperature plunged below freezing. "Do something!" the fat investor screamed, his lips turning a terrifying shade of bruised purple. He was clutching a useless stack of banknotes in his trembling hands, as if the paper money could somehow be burned to generate friction. "We paid for shelter. Fix the fire." "I can't!" Griggs yelled back, his voice cracking with panic as he desperately tried to relight the frozen coal with shaking, frost-bitten fingers. But the wind pouring down the chimney instantly snuffed out his matches. "The wind is blowing straight down. The wood is warping." Then, the final devastating blow of nature's justice struck. The aerodynamic lift generated by the high-speed wind moving over the flat, rigid roof of the bunkhouse reached a critical threshold. With a sound like a cannon firing, the iron nails holding the roof joists sheer snapped. The entire roof of the main logging cabin was violently ripped off, torn into the sky like a piece of paper, exposing 30 men to the naked, murderous fury of the bomb cyclone. Instantly, the men were buried in a blinding vortex of pulverized ice and snow. The heavy, expensive timber walls, no longer stabilized by the roof, began to fold inward. The logging camp of Oakhaven, a monument to greed, built at a cost of thousands of dollars, designed to conquer the wild through brute force and financial superiority, was completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. The wealthy elite, who had mocked a 16-year-old girl just hours prior, who had laughed at her primitive dirt hole, were now crawling on their hands and knees through the freezing mud. They were weeping. They were screaming for mercy from a sky that had none to give. Their $450 cabins were splinters. Their $300 stoves were icy tombstones. Their money was mathematically irrelevant. In the terrifying frozen darkness of the collapsed camp, a desperate realization washed over Bartholomew Vance. The rigid walls of industry had failed him. The only structure left standing in the entire valley, the only thing capable of surviving this apocalyptic drop in pressure, was the very thing he had ordered left behind because it had no commercial value. He looked toward the tree line, his eyelashes freezing together. He knew, with the cold, hard certainty of a man facing his own mortality, that the only warmth left in the world existed inside the hollowed dead wood of the giant sequoia. Swing the pendulum one last time. Inside the tree, Nora heard the distant, muffled crack of the bunkhouse roof tearing away. She closed her eyes. She did not feel the fiery thrill of vengeance. Vengeance is an emotion of the ego, and the forest had stripped her of all ego. She felt only a profound, heavy pity. She looked down at her sleeping brother, safely wrapped in the embrace of the earth, and prepared her heart. She knew they were coming, and she knew that true ancestral wisdom does not answer arrogance with cruelty. It answers it with the sublime, undeniable power of grace. By the time the bleak, gray light of dawn finally broke over the Cascade Mountains, the bomb cyclone had exhausted its fury. The monstrous 80-mile-per-hour winds died down to a hollow, haunting breeze. The snowfall ceased, leaving behind a world buried under 6 feet of blinding white silence. The logging camp of Oakhaven no longer existed. Where the geometric, proud rows of $450 cabins had stood just 12 hours prior, there was now only a chaotic, splintered graveyard of expensive, milled pine. The roofs were gone. The walls had folded like cheap paper under the aerodynamic pressure of the storm. Under the crushing weight of the snow, the imported $300 cast-iron stoves sat useless and dark, acting as freezing monuments to the absolute failure of industrial arrogance. From the wreckage, a pathetic, slow-moving line of figures emerged. They were not the loud, confident masters of the universe who had laughed and drank imported whiskey the night before. They were broken, shivering, half-dead men. Bartholomew Vance, the wealthy logging baron, dragged his feet through the waist-deep snow, his expensive wool coat torn, his lips a horrifying shade of blue. Beside him, Foreman Griggs wept openly, the tears freezing to his cheeks before they could even fall. The wealthy investors from San Francisco leaned on each other, their minds completely shattered by the realization that their money, their ledgers, and their bank accounts had been entirely powerless against the physics of the mountain. They were freezing to death. Their core body temperatures were dropping to fatal levels. They had minutes left before their hearts simply stopped. There was only one direction to walk, only one structure left standing in the entire valley. They marched, a procession of defeated kings, toward the dark, ancient tree line. As they approached the clearing, the sheer, magnificent scale of the dead giant sequoia loomed before them. It stood completely unbothered by the apocalypse that had just leveled their town. Its massive, cylindrical trunk had parted the winds. Its roots held fast to the earth. It was a masterpiece of biological engineering, and it had cost nothing to build. Bartholomew Vance fell to his knees in the snow before the dark, charred opening of the tree. He raised a trembling, frost-bitten fist and knocked, weakly, against the 2-foot-thick, aerogel-like bark. It was a knock devoid of authority. It was the desperate, agonizing plea of a man begging for his life from the very wilderness he had sought to destroy. Inside the earthen bowl, Nora opened her eyes. The air around her was a stable, luxurious 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The 6 river stones, her zero-cost thermal batteries, were still radiating a gentle, comforting heat. Beside her, little Leo slept deeply, his lungs clear, his face flushed with the pink hue of perfect health. Nora heard the pathetic whimpering outside. She stood up, brushed the dry pine needles from her skirt, and walked to the entrance of the hollow. She pushed aside the thick curtain of woven pine boughs she had erected to block the snowdrift. When the barrier opened, a wave of pristine, trapped, geothermal heat rolled out of the tree and washed over the freezing men. To Bartholomew Vance, it felt like the breath of God. Vance looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror, awe, and profound shame. Standing above him was the 16-year-old girl he had condemned to death. She was not shivering. She was not covered in ice. She stood tall, framed by the ancient, charred wood, looking down at the millionaires who were groveling in the dirt. "Please," Vance whispered, his voice cracking, the arrogant timber baron reduced to a begging child. "Our cabins, the wind, the iron froze. We have money. We will pay you. We will pay you anything. Please, let us in." Foreman Griggs, the man who had laughed and told her to enjoy the hospitality of the dirt, was sobbing against the roots of the tree. "I was wrong," he choked out. "The math, the iron, it all failed. Please, girl, have mercy." Here, in this freezing dawn, the ultimate test of the human spirit was revealed. A lesser person, consumed by the ego of the modern world, would have laughed. A lesser person would have quoted their cruel words back to them and left them to the justice of the cold. But Nora was not a creature of ego. She was a guardian of the old ways, and the ancestral wisdom she carried taught that the earth does not hold grudges. The sun does not refuse to warm the wicked, and the tree does not deny shelter to the lost. True strength, the kind of strength that outlasts empires, is rooted in sublime, unconditional grace. Nora did not ask for their money. She did not demand an apology. She simply stepped aside, her voice calm and quiet in the freezing air. "The earth has enough warmth for those who know how to ask," she said softly. "Come inside, but leave your pride in the snow. It will not keep you warm." One by one, the wealthy elite crawled into the hollow of the dead sequoia. As they slid down into the excavated earthen bowl, they felt the miraculous 50-degree geothermal embrace of the deep soil. They saw the tiny, highly efficient Dakota firehole, an engineering marvel that had consumed $0 and 3 handfuls of twigs, yet had defeated a bomb cyclone. They felt the radiating infrared energy of the thermal mass stones. Bartholomew Vance sat with his back against the thick bark, watching little Leo sleeping peacefully, entirely untouched by the storm. The millionaire lowered his face into his freezing hands and wept. He wept for his arrogance. He wept for his ignorance. In that silent, warm sanctuary, the great illusion of the industrial age was shattered forever. The loggers realized that their $450 cabins and their expensive coal had never been a measure of safety. They had been a measure of their disconnect from reality. The men who worshipped money had been saved by a 16-year-old orphan who understood the free, undeniable physics of nature. This is the legacy of the austral survival. It is a mathematical, historical, and spiritual truth that the elites of the world constantly try to bury under concrete and iron. They want you to believe that you must buy your survival. They want you to believe that without their expensive systems, you are helpless against the elements. But the dead sequoia stands as an eternal witness to their lie. Thermal mass, passive geothermal energy, and the supreme insulation of natural fibers are not primitive concepts. They are the advanced, perfect mechanics of a world that was designed to protect us, if only we possess the humility to learn its rules. Nora did not conquer the mountain. She harmonized with it. And in doing so, she built a fortress of absolute peace in the middle of a frozen apocalypse. If this story resonated with your spirit, if you believe that true wealth is not measured by the numbers in a bank account, but by the ancestral wisdom we carry in our minds and the grace we hold in our hearts, then I invite you to make your voice heard. Subscribe to the Legado Austral channel to join a community that refuses to forget the old ways. Leave a like to help this manifesto of resilience break through the noise of the modern world, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the greatest solutions are often the simplest ones. And before you go, tell me in the comments below. From which city and country are you watching this today? Let us see how far the roots of this ancient wisdom have spread across the earth. Until our next journey into the forgotten truths of history, remember, the storm will always come for the proud, but the earth will always shelter the humble. Stay strong, stay wise, and protect your legacy.